Where did you grow up? How was childhood?
I grew up in Arizona.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it was pretty good. I don't know. Pretty normal childhood, I guess.
Yeah. So when did you figure out you want to make games for the rest of your life?
Probably sometime, probably when I was around 17 or 18.
Oh.
Me and my friends we started just messing around making games, just as a hobby, really, more than anything. And then there was a board game we really liked, so we made it into a computer game, and that really kind of kick-started everything.
Oh yeah. What was the board game?
The board game was called Dungeon Bowl.
Oh,
It was like an old Games Workshop board game.
Uh-huh.
So we had all our own house rules, and we had our own version of the game that we liked. And we're like, hey, we want to make a computer game version of this. So it wasn't exactly like that, what we ended up making, but that was kind of the inspiration for the game we made.
Yeah, so RPG from beginning.
Yeah.
Oh, let's talk about Crush Deluxe. You remember that game?
Yeah, that's the game I was just talking about.
Yeah. So that's that's a game I kind of define as an RPG sport dungeon crawler. I don't know, and I think you started making RPGs from the beginning. So why do you like it so much, that RPG vibe in your games?
I grew up playing a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I always liked adventure games like Zelda or Dragon Quest,
Yeah.
which later on became, Dragon Warrior. That's what it was called when I first played it. But I don't know. I just kind of naturally gravitated to those kind of games. So when it came to making games myself, it seemed like a pretty natural fit.
Oh yeah. So was your first game successful financially?
It was for me at the time. I mean, I was like super young, so we didn't make. It was a lot of money for a young kid, but by today's standards, it probably wasn't that successful.
Yeah. So you were making games in different companies, but when, and more importantly, why did you decide to start your own thing and call it Vigil Games?
Yeah, well, so I mean, even the studio before, I've never actually worked for anybody else. So the first studio I started was called Stone Jackal Studios,
Yeah.
which me and my friends founded, and then I found another one outside of college called what was it called? Realm Interactive,
Mm-hmm.
and then eventually we founded Vigil Games, and I think we really founded Vigil Games because we wanted to make console games. And at the time, I was working at NCSoft, and they didn't really have any interest in doing console games, so we left to start Vigil.
So you were pretty young when you started your own company. Were you afraid? Or did you know anything about management and how's it going to work out, financially?
No, I
Especially
didn't know
back in
anything.
those
I didn't really
days.
care.
These days, I think it's much more. Do you agree? I think this is right now. It's much more easier to start an indie company, comparing to those days. And that was a big thing.
I mean, when we did Vigil, like if we hadn't got a publisher, we would have been dead in the water. There was you couldn't. There was really no good way to sell your games directly to players.
Oh, yeah. So you started Vigil and you were like, okay, we got to make games. And that, I think, is a very tough situation to be in because your next game is your debut and it might actually be the last game from your company because business is tough. So how did you realize Darksiders is a confident IP to start with?
I think for us, it was like we just liked the basic idea. I mean, we kind of knew what type of game we wanted to make. We wanted to make something that was like kind of Zelda, kind of, it had a little bit of Prince of Persia in there with the platforming elements. And we had a bunch of different elements from different games we wanted to include. And then we had a bunch of different ideas as far as what the setting would be. And eventually one of us came up with the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse idea. And we're like, yeah, that's cool. Let's just go with that. I don't think we didn't really second guess it. Once we decided what we were going to do, we just ran with it.
So when you started Darksiders 1, did you have any plan that it's going to have sequels? You're going to discover death or...
No.
Not
In fact, we finished Darksiders 1. And we're like, crap, we got to make a sequel. So we had to kind of like go back and figure out what the lore and the story was to make it work for the sequel.
So when did you decide to make a sequel? After releasing the game to see that, great reception of the game, or was it before the releasing of the game?
I think we had talked about it a little bit before we released the game, but we didn't really know how well it was going to do, so we didn't really think about it seriously until after the game came out and we saw that it did pretty well.
Oh, so how did you decide that Death is going to be the hero of the second one?
I don't know. That was kind of a weird decision. We just didn't want to do the same character because we thought everybody else, when they make sequels, they just use the same character. We thought it would be cool to switch up characters.
Yeah.
Which was kind of stupid because we had to redo everything from scratch. But it was fun for us to be able to have a different main character.
Exactly. Darksiders 2 is very different to the first one, and it continued to the third one being different to the last two ones. And I like it. I think you have enough courage to try different things rather than, repeating the same formula. How do you decide these changes? Is there any doubt designing a sequel that fans might say, oh, this is not like the last one?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it takes a lot of guts because most people will make a game and then, like you said, they'll just like, hey, let's make a sequel that has all the same elements with with a new story and some new mechanics. But we pretty much have committed to say, all right, every game's going to be slightly different. I mean, it's just fun for us as developers to just try different styles of game. I mean, there's a core to the games that are still similar. There's still combat. There's still puzzles. Mm-hmm. There's like a common thread through all the games, but we try to change up as much of the formula as possible to keep it from becoming stale.
Yeah. So tell me about the day Vigil ended. How did that happen, and how did you sleep that night?
Yeah, I don't remember how I slept, honestly, but yeah, it was pretty crazy. We when THQ went to bankruptcy, we kind of expected someone to purchase Vigil Games, or at least purchase the Darksiders IP, but they didn't. Partially because we didn't really have anything in development. A lot of the other studios were pretty far along. Like, they had games that were almost done, or like the games that THQ had already put a ton of money into. So it was a good buy for people to pick up at the auction. But like Vigil, we had just finished the game. So when someone looked at buying Vigil Games, they didn't really get anything except for the people. So it was a bit of a shock, but
yeah,
it happened.
And then
I don't know. I probably didn't sleep that well, but I don't remember.
And then you started Critic US department. So
yes.
How was that? How was the experience in that?
It was really fun at first. I mean, we all got to keep working together, which is really important. They pretty much let us work on whatever we wanted. They said, hey, just make a game, make it cool. So, for a good year or so, we were having a lot of fun working on a project there. And then eventually they just had some money problems and they stopped paying us. So obviously you can only go so long when you're not getting a paycheck.
Yeah. So that is what I appreciate about you. That, of course, you started Vigil and Crytek, now Gunfire, but you guys are always stuck together and you supported each other, the core team of the studio, and that is great. I think, how many years you've been working with I think most of the team at Gunfire?
Oh yeah, I don't know. Like, a lot of the people that work here I've been working with them since Darksiders 1. So I don't know, what was that, like 12 years ago, 13 years ago? It's been a long time.
Yeah.
Long time, yeah. The tech director here at Gunfire Games was one of our first employees at Vigil Games.
So yeah, they like their boss, I guess. So
I guess so. Yeah, we've worked together a long time.
Yeah, when you decided to start Gunfire Games, what were the lessons you learned from starting Vigil, and what was different about Gunfire?
I think we just knew a lot more. Like, when we started Vigil, we didn't know anything about making console games. We didn't know anything about like operating a big studio or any of that type of stuff. So when we made Gunfire, we were way more efficient, we were able to hit the ground running and be able to produce stuff pretty quick. I mean, at Vigil, it took us years before we really even had anything to show anybody with Darksiders because we were still just sort of figuring everything out.
Yeah, and I can see it in Gunfire. You're trying different ideas with smaller games. I think that's financially is more safer way to continue this studio. And they're all amazing games.
Yeah, and it's a lot more satisfying as a developer,
Yeah.
When you work on one game over like 4 years, I mean, it's still fun, but it can kind of drag on a little bit because you're just doing the same thing for year after year after year. But we've been around about 4 years at Gunfire, and I think we've shipped like 5 or 6 games at this point. Yeah. So it's a lot different than it was at Vigil.
So now you have more games right now. Of course, your duties as a manager of this studio is heavier than before. So are you still designing some games? Are you involved in those games, or are you just managing the studio?
Yeah, I'm not a very typical manager. Like, I still am very involved in working on the games. I like programming. I like doing design. I like doing all that kind of stuff. So I generally tend to hire people to just do all the management stuff for me.
Yeah. That's great. So what were the initial ideas about making Darksiders 3? Why did you decide to change the gear in the third one?
I think, well, I mean, first of all, we wanted the abilities to be just more endemic to her. Like, we didn't want her picking up items and using items as much. We wanted to just be like manifestations of her own power. And then I think probably the first big decision that affected a lot of things is we wanted to do a more open, or not open, but like a more Metroidvania style world instead of a hub and spoke. And we also didn't want to lock you into combat. Like Darksiders 1 and Darksiders 2 relied pretty heavily on, like, you go into a room, red barriers appear, and then you fight wave after wave of enemies before you go to the next room. So once we decided we did not want to do that, it kind of drove a lot of the decisions as far as like pacing, difficulty level, how enemy encounters were done. Because once you get rid of the red barriers, like, it just changes the way you have to set up the combat and all that type of stuff.
Yeah. So how do you design combat systems? What tips do you have for people starting out?
Oh, I mean, the biggest tip I can give is just to play other games. I mean, there's so many great examples and systems and things that other people have done. I know that, like, in Darksiders 1, we were having trouble because the sword combat didn't feel that well. And so, you know, one of the suggestions I had was like, hey, let's just take a game that we know feels good and, like, let's copy it at first just to understand why it feels good. Yeah. And I think after we did that, we had a better understanding of, like, oh, this is why they make the animation like this, or this is why there's this much wind up on the attacks, or this is why the attacks are this snappy. And then once you have that information, it's a lot easier to then move in and start designing your own stuff. You know, another classic example is, like, if you pay attention, a lot of games steal the jump timings from the original Mario game because Nintendo spent a lot of time messing with that timing to make sure it felt good. And just by looking at Mario to see, oh, he jumps for like 0.98 seconds or whatever it is, you learn a lot about, like, just the feel of things and how they feel well. And I can usually tell a game if people haven't spent a lot of time, like, referencing old games or trying to capture that feel. Like, one of the first things that comes across is when the jump feels bad. And that's a great example of where you just have to go look at the masters, and they spent a lot of time trying to make sure that stuff felt good.
Yeah, that's great advice. So you have designed you have experience designing tons of boss fights. What is the key thing to design a boss, and what do you suggest to wannabe boss fight designers? I
think one of the most important things about the boss fight, I always try to think about what will they remember after the fight. Like, what's the one cool thing the boss does that, you know, 3 days later, a week later, a month later, like, oh yeah, that was that boss that turned into a ball and rolled around the arena and tried to smash you, or whatever it is. That's number one for me. And then the next thing is, like, what are you challenging the player to do that they haven't done before? Even if it's just a minor twist on something, you know, maybe in this fight the boss forces you to move around because he casts things on the ground that cause the arena to be hazardous, so you can't just stand in one place.
Yeah.
And that's changing the expectation or making them, like, expand what they're doing and think differently is another big part of making the bosses interesting.
So do you suggest for people who are not very familiar designing boss that if they're, you know, in doubt of designing or not designing a boss, you suggest them to just don't do it if you don't know how to do it, because, you know, boss could be very tricky.
Sure. I would, like, my advice is you either make it really simple, because anybody can make a simple boss, right? Yeah. And make it present very well. Like, make sure the animations are nice, make sure he does cool stuff. Because you can have a really simple fight. The actual fight's not that complex, but people remember it. And I remember there was a God of War where there was a boss where the actual fight was interesting. He just, like, summoned people to come fight you.
Yeah.
But at the end of the fight, you, like, smashed his head into a door, and you have to pound the B button and it let you keep smashing his head over and over into the door. And at the end of the day, I still remember that fight, even though the fight wasn't that great. I just remember that, oh yeah, that was that guy I got to smash his head in the door. So you either go that route where you make it really simple but memorable, or if you have a really cool idea to make the fight more complex and challenge the player, you got to make sure it's a really good idea, and you don't want to you just got to make sure it's something the player can pick up on and it doesn't become too frustratingly hard.
Yeah. That reminded me of The Darkness 1. Have you played The Darkness?
Yep. How long time ago, yeah.
Yeah. You remember the final boss fight of that game?
I actually don't think I got to the end. I got halfway through, I think.
So the final boss of the game was...
I was working on Darksiders 1 when that game came out.
So the final boss was... I was constantly shooting at him. I couldn't get past that final boss. And the key was not shooting at him. You just stand there, and suddenly after some minutes, the game ends. That was one of the best boss fights ever. So last week I tweeted that I'm going to talk to you, and I asked people to ask their questions. I'm going to shoot some of them here, so you might want to answer them. Warning, they're tough.
Okay.
So
no worries.
This is from Patrick Braga, I think. Will Darkness 2 and 3 be brought to Switch as well?
Darksiders 1 and 2? I think 2 is already on the Switch. I'm not really sure about 1. I actually don't have as much knowledge of that just because that's handled mostly by THQ Nordic corporate. But 2 is definitely already on. When we worked on 2 at Vigil, it was... Oh, no, not the Switch. I'm sorry. That was on the Wii U. Yes, I think
1 is on Switch, I guess.
But I don't know for sure.
Yeah. So next question.
Yeah, I got confused, yes.
Shatterstar 187. Has Darkness 3 been success enough for the THQ to greenlight a sequel?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So there's a possibility.
I mean, I won't say whether they've greenlit a sequel or not, but I think it's definitely been successful enough for them to greenlight a sequel if they wanted to.
Yeah. So, Les Hybrid or Lay Hybrid, I don't know. What was the reason for excluding Fury's horse in the game? That's a very...
It was mostly because of the... Yeah, we wanted to make a world that was very 3D. So, if you look at the world of Darksiders 3, there were only a few spots where you could actually ride the horse without it being annoying, because there's a lot more underground areas, there's a lot more smaller passageways and stuff like that. So at the end of the day, it was you're going to be able to literally ride it in 1 or 2 spots. What's the point of including it? And we just thought it would have been frustrating to the player if they'd have got this cool horse mechanic that could use in 2 areas. So we thought it fit better in as a story beat to give her some motivation in the story.
Yeah, that's a great thing about you, because you're not just building up on previous features in the game. So okay, the previous game we had a horse, now we have to evolve the horse in the third one. You're just going for different experiences and how fun this could be. I really, really appreciate that. So, next question. Siavash Khaksar, Iranian guy. Darksiders 3 supports Farsi language. Do you know the reason behind this decision? I guess no other game before this did such a thing, support Farsi language.
Yeah, I think that was more of a decision for THQ. They came to us and they said, hey, we want to support this language. And we were like, all right. I mean, we didn't mind doing the work. And, I don't know what their original motivation was, but we thought it was cool. And we're like, if it exposes the game to a whole other group of gamers, then all the power to it. That's awesome.
Man, you have no idea how many people played that game because of that. So this one's from me. Cool. I'm a video game composer and sound designer, and I want to know what happened to the idea of just a kid composing Darksider 3.
We actually, so the guy that ended up composing it was the composer from Darksiders 1. So we just shook it up. We liked him too. Mm-hmm. We liked Jesper Kid. Chris, I can't remember. I don't want to mess up his last name, so I'm not going to say him. But his first name's Chris, and I can't remember his last name. But we really liked his stuff. We liked his stuff from Darksiders 1, and we thought it would fit better because of the area we're in. Earth, Jesper's Kid stuff was much more fantasy.
Yeah,
it was beautiful music, right? It was really great for the Makers area and stuff like that.
I love it.
So I don't know. It was just a decision we made.
Okay. Last but not least, my old friend Ishbin Farinas send her regards. That's it.
Okay. All right. Well, hello.
Yeah. Thank you so much, David. I love your games. You're such a visionary
Yeah,
game
no problem.
designer and leader, and I wish you and entire team of Gunfire Games, especially Alicia, the best.
All right. Well, thank you. It was
Yeah,
good talking to you.